Welcome to this explainer on the U.S. judicial system. We're going to look past those breaking news alerts on your phone and really unpack the actual mechanics of how the courts operate, how they're structured, and honestly, how they wield so much power over our daily lives. Let's break down this giant, complex institution.
To understand where we are, we really have to start at the beginning. Way back in Federalist Note 78, Alexander Hamilton actually called the judiciary the least dangerous branch of government. His argument was that because the courts couldn't command the military, the sword, or control the budget, the purse, they possessed only the power of judgment. They couldn't even enforce their own rulings.
So, to see how that mere judgment evolved into the absolute powerhouse it is today, here is our roadmap. First, the power of judicial review. Second, the dual court system. Third, the tiers of federal justice. Fourth, appointing judges. And finally, we'll go inside the Supreme Court.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the power of judicial review. Given his early writings about the court's quote-unquote natural feebleness, you really have to ask, would Hamilton be shocked to see them acting as a co-equal branch today? Unlike the early days when the Supreme Court didn't even have its own building, they literally met in a small committee room beneath the House chamber. Today's courts are capable of massive, sweeping public policy shifts.
This immense authority actually stems from a single precedent back in 1803, Marbury versus Madison. That case established judicial review. By granting themselves the power to strike down unconstitutional actions, the courts essentially made themselves the ultimate umpire. And that paved the way for monumental shifts over the decades, from desegregating schools to guaranteeing attorneys for poor defendants, all the way to the national recognition of same-sex marriage.
And why does this matter to us? Well, because courts aren't just sitting around debating abstract legal theories. They decide specific cases that affect our everyday lives. Take the Abercrombie and Fitch case, for example. The Supreme Court ruled the company couldn't deny employment to a Muslim woman wearing a hijab, which protected religious minorities from discrimination. They've also defined modern free speech limits, like determining that violent rap lyrics posted on Facebook didn't constitute a true legal threat. And for sure, they've umpired sweeping national policies like the Affordable Care Act by navigating some incredibly complex constitutional challenges.
Moving right along, let's get into Section 2, the dual court system.
Now, you might be thinking the federal courts handle everything, but the U.S. actually operates on a dual court system. While federal courts grab all the national headlines, state courts are the true workhorses here. They quietly handle a massive 90% of the nation's cases, day-to-day crimes, family law, probate, the whole shebang. The federal dockets are strictly reserved for constitutional questions, interstate matters, or disputes involving more than $75,000. This setup creates some pretty wild geographic variations, which is brilliantly illustrated by looking at the legal status of marijuana across the country. Because states create their own laws distinct from the national government, we get this complex patchwork. In some states, it's fully regulated for adult use. In others, it's strictly prohibited.
And this creates a totally fascinating legal paradox. Under federal law, marijuana is still widely restricted, so someone could legally purchase it under their own state's law, but theoretically face a federal raid for that exact same action. This friction constantly forces the courts to step in and sort out the clash between state sovereignty and federal supremacy.
Okay, on to Section 3, tiers of federal justice. Let's look at the actual architecture here. The federal judiciary basically operates as a three-tiered pipeline. Cases originate at the wide base in one of the 94 U.S. district courts. These are your trial courts. If a party loses and appeals, they move up to the middle tier, the 13 U.S. circuit courts. And finally, a tiny, tiny fraction of those cases land at the single Supreme Court right at the very top.
Now, these 13 circuit courts, they're divided geographically, covering specific clusters of states, alongside two highly influential specialized circuits located in Washington, D.C. And at this level, there are no trials, no juries. Instead, rotating panels of 3 judges just review the lower court decisions to ensure the law was actually applied correctly.
So how do you keep this massive, multi-tiered system consistent across the entire country? Judges rely on a legal principle called stare decisis. It's Latin for stand by things decided. It basically means they are bound by precedent. By basing today's decisions on past court rulings, it ensures the law remains stable and predictable, rather than just changing arbitrarily based on whichever judge happens to be sitting on the bench that day.
All right, let's talk about the people wearing the robes. Section 4, appointing federal judges. Historically, the federal judiciary was overwhelmingly dominated by white Protestant men. And while the courts have definitely grown more diverse over time to better reflect the nation, the makeup today still leans heavily toward a white and male majority, with current demographic data showing it's about 74% white.
Now, because these federal judges receive lifetime appointments, which, by the way, was a deliberate design choice intended to shield them from the political winds of the moment, picking them is incredibly high stakes. It requires a highly scrutinized dance. First, a presidential nomination, then intense discussion and vetting in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and ultimately it takes confirmation by a majority vote of the full Senate.
And that brings us to the absolute apex, Section 5, inside the Supreme Court. The High Court consists of just one Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. Over the centuries, its membership has slowly evolved, marked by some pretty major milestones. From the first Catholic and Jewish justices in the 19th and early 20th centuries to the landmark appointments of Thurgood Marshall, Sandra Day O'Connor, and Sonia Sotomayor. These shifts really reflect the changing fabric of our country. If you look at today's court, it features justices appointed by several different presidents across entirely different eras of our recent history. Because they serve for life, each president who successfully appoints a justice leaves a lasting ideological legacy. It's a legacy that will stretch far, far beyond their own 4 or 8 years in the Oval Office. Honestly, a single appointment can tip the balance of legal interpretation for an entire generation.
Which brings us to a really vital question. These 9 unelected justices hold immense policymaking power, relying on a doctrine of judicial review that isn't even explicitly written in the Constitution. So we have to wonder, does this modern court system, with all its sheer power and complexity, ultimately protect our fundamental democratic ideals, or does it challenge them? It's definitely something to think about the next time you see a major ruling flash across your newsfeed. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack the courts today. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next Explainer.